perfect way to start a video. Some nice breaths in, breaths out. But in this video today, we're going to discuss both prolactin and oxytocin at the same time. So prolactin and oxytocin, they are separate hormones, but we're going to explain and dive into them at the same time here. It'll make sense why in a momentarily. So let's start with it. So prolactin, actually, the anterior pituitary gland produces and secretes prolactin. So prolactin is produced and secreted by the anterior pituitary gland, where oxytocin, hypothalamus produces oxytocin. It's secreted by the posterior pituitary gland. So prolactin produced and secreted by the anterior pituitary gland, oxytocin produced by the hypothalamus, secreted by the posterior pituitary gland. And oxytocin does the target organs are the uterus and the mammary gland. So the uterus and mammary gland, hypothalamus produce the oxytocin, aka OT for short, but just stick with oxytocin, and the posterior pituitary gland secretes it. So oxytocin does stimulate uterine contractions. So let's look at a kind of an example of how this would go. So posterior pituitary gland releases oxytocin, which causes uterine contractions, which compresses the fetus, the head of the fetus, against the cervix. So the cervix is the portion of the uterus that connects with the vagina. So the head of the fetus is going to compress against the cervix, which will stimulate nerve reflexes back to the posterior pituitary gland, or back to the pituitary gland, and the hypothalamus, which will ultimately cause the increased secretion of oxytocin, and the cycle will continue. So this is a positive feedback mechanism. So this oxytocin, the uterine contractions, ultimately aid in the delivery of the baby. So the posterior pituitary gland releases the OT, uterine contractions, head of the fetus compresses against the cervix, which stimulates more nerve impulses, which causes more uterine contractions. More oxytocin to be secreted, which causes more uterine contractions, and continues, and ultimately aids in the delivery of a baby. So that's oxytocin is a very necessary thing for birth. You or I wouldn't be here without oxytocin, put it that way, or some form, or for something synthetic form if our bodies can't produce it naturally. But prolactin, it does target the mammary glands, and we'll see. Oxytocin does too, and we'll get there in a moment. But prolactin targets the mammary glands to increase the production of milk. So prolactin promotes milk production. Prolactin also targets the brain to increase the sense of bonding. So it targets brain, promotes a sense of bonding between mom and baby. And oxytocin does stimulate milk secretion. So prolactin stimulates milk production. Oxytocin stimulates milk secretion. So milk production and milk secretion, they both are positive feedback mechanisms. So let's look at another example here. So the baby suckling at the breast here. So I'm not a mom, I've never breastfed, so I think it goes something like that. But the baby suckling at the breast stimulates a nerve reflex back to the hypothalamus and pituitary glands, pituitary gland, two parts of the pituitary gland, which increases the production and secretion of prolactin and oxytocin, which means increases milk production, increases milk secretion, and the baby then in turn increases suckling at the breast to get more food. So this is a positive feedback mechanism once again. So essentially, the more the baby feeds, the more milk that is produced. So this process happens over somewhat of a longer period of time, but essentially this is what happens. The more baby feeds on the breast, the more milk will be produced and will be secreted eventually at the end of the day. So there's a lot of benefits with breastfeeding. It obviously increases the sense of bonding between promotes a sense of bonding, and mom feels more inclined to care for the baby. Also, it's helpful to breastfeed immediately after delivery. It'll decrease the chance of hemorrhage, so bleeding out for the mom. And another benefit when breastfeeding, the oxytocin is still causing uterine contractions, so to bring the uterus back to the pre-delivery state. So the contractions helped more blood to get to the area, to the uterus, which helps it to heal faster and faster and faster. So that's one more thing actually before we do a quick review back through. Pitocin is a synthetic oxytocin. So if mother's having troubles with uterine contractions due to abnormal levels of oxytocin. Pitocin is a synthetic form to help those uterine contractions take place. So just a quick review back through. Prolactin, produced and secreted by the anterior pituitary gland, targets mammary glands to promote milk production, also targets the brain to promote a sense of bonding. Oxytocin, produced by the hypothalamus, secreted by the posterior pituitary gland, targets the uterus and mammary glands, targets the uterus to increase uterine contractions, targets the mammary glands to increase or stimulate milk secretion. So prolactin, milk production, oxytocin, milk secretion, they both are milk secretion, milk production, both are positive feedback mechanisms.